Hi, I'm Joe Levy, the CEO of Sophos.
I'm Wendy Nather. I'm the Senior Research Initiatives Director at 1Password.
Wendy, you've had a really illustrious career. You've been a public sector CISO, private sector CISO. You've been an analyst, a practitioner. And back in 2011, when you were at 451 Research, you coined the term security poverty line. Take us back to the formation of that idea. What was the original inspiration for that? And how has that evolved over time since then?
Yeah, the initial inspiration for that was when I started as a Texas state agency CISO. It was my first day on the job. I was the only security person, and I walked in and they said, "We need your budget request by the end of the day today." So I wrote down like $2,000. I wanted to get a logging server and a couple of books. And the person I was reporting to scribbled it out and said, "Where do you think you are, the private sector?" So I had zero budget and zero people when I started in that position. And it really annoyed me looking on Twitter and other social media how the loudest people were often researchers who said, "Oh, I can't believe they're not doing this. I can't believe they're not patching. How stupid can you be?" And I realized that nobody was standing up for these people and saying, "Look, patching is hard. It's not that these people are stupid or unaware, uninformed, incapable, malicious, or anything. It's this stuff, applied security as opposed to theoretical security, is hard." When I became an analyst at 451, I decided to write about it because I felt it deserved attention. And then over the years, as I've been, working with people and talking to people, I started dividing it up more into what other components of the security poverty line are there, not just money, but also expertise, capability, and influence.
Did you know it at the time that it had a very convenient acronym of MESSY if you actually apply an acronym to money, expertise, capability, and influence?
No, this is the first time I've ever heard that. That's great.
It
Thank
occurred to
you.
me the other day, and it's a really convenient way to remember it, I think, and it's very it's descriptive.
That's brilliant. Thank you. So, Joe, you authored a piece called "The Cybersecurity Poverty Line: Why It Exists and Why Sophos Exists to Erase It." And I'd love to hear more about what that means to you, how you came up with that.
Obviously strongly inspired by your initial framing of this. I think the fact that we're evolving past the point where we think of cybersecurity as purely a technological challenge and rather viewing it as a combination of technological and economic challenges that we deal with has been very helpful. So I found your initial framing inspirational, and that led us to the point where we can make this kind of bold, ambitious statement that we're going to attempt to erase the poverty line. When I think about the mechanisms of getting there, obviously technology itself is going to be a means to that end. And there have been some changes over the recent 5 years, I would say, that have led to that kind of confidence that this is going to be achievable. And I would just look at a couple of examples to begin with of why this is not strictly a matter of money, why this is not strictly a matter of what the size of an organization might happen to be. I think historically there might have been an intuition that small businesses all exist under the poverty line and large businesses all exist over the poverty line.
Yeah.
And that intuition is entirely incorrect, as you've discovered, I'm sure. We have customers, for example, that are fairly small organizations. Maybe they have 100 or 200 employees. But they have a kind of a modernity and a maturity and a discipline to the way that they operate that permit them to operate well above the poverty line. They do all the right things. They have good architectural designs from the start. They have good governance practices internally. This is a reference to the maturity, of course. And then on the opposite side of the coin, there are very, very large organizations, and they perhaps lack that kind of maturity. And this is not just a matter of dysfunction. This has been my experience too. And it's almost paradoxical because there are a number of large companies that we deal with, 25,000, 50,000 employees, and the company is undergoing significant bursts of prosperity. And we're seeing this happening a lot in like manufacturing right now, for example, because like the drive that we're seeing to rapidly build out data centers, for example, it's driving rapid top-line prosperity and growth with these organizations, and they're growing through acquisition. And some of them are doing like one acquisition a month, or maybe even more than that. And just the accumulation of technical debt that they experience as a result of this like burst of prosperity, that's what's actually driving their challenges. And it's creating these sorts of economic hardships for them along those four dimensions that you described: money, expertise, capability, and influence. And they just can't keep up with their own prosperity. And that drives them below the cybersecurity poverty line.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't tracked it like that, but I have a friend, for example, who's a consultant for a Fortune 50 company who had their IP stolen by an Asian country. And when he started to say, well, let's, put some better security in place, they said, why? We've lost our IP. It's gone. Why should we spend money on it now? It's too late. So yeah, when you hear things like that, you know that there are so many more dynamics in play for that than just, well, spend everything you can. I heard of another bank, a really big one, that has virtually unlimited security budget, and yet if you were trying to pull logs, particular logs from someplace, it can take weeks or a month to get it because they're just not, that process isn't structured enough.
Right. And sometimes it's the design of the organization itself that becomes the friction point for being able to make those kinds of changes. And it could be as simple as what the organizational reporting lines and structures and leadership teams look like that inhibit the solution to these sorts of problems. Like they recognize that they're dealing with that kind of challenge, but they don't actually have the means. And it could be political within the organization that prevents them from solving that.
Cultural, political, all of that. And the environment. In Europe, it may be easier to do something than it is here.
Wendy, you just made reference to the four forces that can drive organizations below the cybersecurity poverty line, and you defined them as money, expertise, capability, and influence. I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on those for me.
Money's, budget is pretty obvious. People tend to think of that first, and they think that if we just throw money at the problem, that'll solve it. But not necessarily, because part of it is being able to afford the people you need to be able to do that. And unfortunately, the best and the most senior employees are ones that you end up competing with security vendors to hire, and usually they can afford a more generous salary and everything than you can. So you're just kind of stuck with whatever your IT people can pick up. That leads us to expertise, which is, again, people tend to think that the answer is just to give free training to people, and that's not it, because expertise is the combination of skills and experience to know what to do with something that you've never seen before, because that's our day. Every day in cybersecurity, we go, wow, that just happened. Okay, now what do we do? Right. Capability, even if you know what you need to do, can you carry it out? And this is where we see constraints in a lot of different environments and different verticals, different geographic locations. There are some things you just cannot do. And we have so many conventional wisdom rules. I won't even say compliance, but just pieces of wisdom that everybody takes for granted, like an authentication system should always fail closed. Well, you can't do that in a healthcare environment if it keeps a doctor away from the patient. There are just some things that are not going to happen. If you work for a telco provider, anything that blocks packets, that blocks traffic, you're going to have a really hard time pushing for. Or in the hospitality industry, anything that disrupts the guest experience is a big no-no. So multi-factor authentication, if it's not done right, can be really, really tough to sell to your business.
And influence, we talked a little bit about this one already, just being able to exert the kind of political capital that's necessary to get change done within an organization or to get budgets approved.
Or outside with your suppliers. I would go to one of our suppliers and say, I'm going to need you to fix this security flaw, and they'd say, well, you're the only one who's complaining about it, so no, we're not going to fix it.
Yeah.
Or we'll fix it if you pay us to fix it. If you're an airline, whatever you ask for, you'll probably get. The other thing is that these organizations are not invited to the closed door roundtables where policy is made, where solutions are drawn up. And I wish that were different, because, you could get some really practical people who have been living this coming in and going, yeah, that's not going to work.
Right. Those were great examples, by the way, domain-specific examples of where the conventional wisdom doesn't actually apply, and it just wouldn't make sense to do the thing that, as cybersecurity practitioners, we've always believed are the right practices. the fact that influence isn't just internal influence within an organization, but external influence. And perhaps that's even a greater version of the influence problem. And it's a kind of an expression of the category of third-party risk or nth-party risk that we deal with every single day. It's not just a matter of somebody in your supply chain having some sort of a security incident, but the example that you gave of there being some kind of exposure that they just don't think is significant enough because you're the only one who's really concerned about it. Those are great examples of problems that are outside of your control. Like even if you recognize them and you have the desire to fix them, sometimes you simply can't.
You're stuck. If you don't run your own network, there's only so much you can do at the network layer. And it's very tough to work with suppliers who, first of all, don't take it seriously. The other problem is that if you don't have the talent in-house, you're more heavily dependent on those third parties to make risk decisions that maybe, you should be the one making, but you can't because you don't have the expertise you need.
Right. And the last bit of this that I'd like to explore, and then we can move on to some other topics, the whole category of the cybersecurity skills gap that we deal with. And there's been some debate in the industry about whether the often cited statistics are really relevant or accurate or meaningful to this. How do you think about the skills gap, whether it's fingers on keyboard practitioner or maybe it's leadership skills? How influential is that in the whole equation?
The skills gap in particular, I'm not a believer in that. Maybe just because I started in this 30 years ago where, there were no explicit rules or areas of specialization or anything like that. And so a lot of us came from, unconventional backgrounds. I was a liberal arts major and, we just, oh, you too? Yay. And that just, you make stuff up as you go along because this is really a frontier area. We are still trying to figure this out every single day. I mean, I have brought people into the industry who had similarly no background, but I knew they were really, really good. When I was promoted to director at a Swiss bank, they gave me a personal assistant because that came with the position. I didn't hire her. She just showed up one day. And after I worked with her, I figured out she was really smart, very capable. And I said, I don't need a PA. So I put her in charge of my access control team. Most recently, when I heard from her, she was running the regional CISO group for Standard Chartered Bank.
How awesome.
She did the rest herself. I think if you sit on the bus with somebody and you start talking with them about security principles, not the technology, but how could you keep somebody from doing something? They will be able to figure it out. They have the innate ability to reason it out. All you have to do is teach them the technology part.
Yeah.
Leadership, that's one of those things that people call soft skills that I think I would call it social engineering. If you're a CISO, that is the hardest social engineering job there is.
Right.
You can get 1,000 people to click on a link. That's nothing. If you can get 1,000 people to stop clicking on a link, then you've got real power.
Yeah, that is a great example. And I never really thought of the role of the CISO as being kind of executive social engineering, but so often it has to be just that because they tend to lead by influence. They're not leading because they've got the teams reporting to them who can then be commanded or mandated to go do the right thing. That's a really good way to think about it. So Wendy, I have to ask you the unavoidable question.
Sure.
How has AI changed the security poverty line?
I think one of the most obvious things, going back to the money, is just the economics of using AI today now that there is consumption-based billing. If you are a small organization and you don't know what you're going to be spending, you're facing variable costs that could be run up if somebody does something really stupid with a prompt, or if an attacker decides to burn up your tokens. This is not sustainable for anybody with a limited budget. And so we see a lot of large organizations who can afford to absorb that hit are doing well with AI, but I can't see that working very well with those below the poverty line. There's still the expertise problem. I've heard a lot of people say, well, just use an open source model. But again, what are you going to run it on? You're going to run it on somebody's laptop with what army? That's still not a solution to the problem. And so I think because of the unpredictability of what AI brings, you can't necessarily rely on a model that you're using to do the same thing reliably and consistently every single time. And then if you don't have the maturity to recover from an oopsie, then it's going to be harder on your organization than it is on larger ones. I was talking with Alex Pinto, who is the director of the Verizon DBIR, and he said something really interesting. He believes that we are entering into a gilded age of security thanks to AI. And, people who have read up on history and understand the dynamics there, they see a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. What do you think about that?
I think we're absolutely going to see that kind of dynamic emerge, and it's going to happen on a couple of fronts. One, I think those organizations that are going to be able to successfully leverage AI for their defense are going to have a better time against attackers. And of course, we're already seeing an abundant amount of evidence that attackers are beginning to leverage AI on their own. We always knew this day would come. We just didn't know when it would happen. It's upon us at this point. So that's one gap that I think we're going to see between the defenders and the attackers. Within the defender category itself, though, I also think that we're going to begin to see a widening gap because those organizations that operate below the poverty line, they're probably also going to operate below the poverty line when it comes to the use and adoption of AI, as you already mentioned. And then we're going to see a disparity happen within the customer base itself or within particular sectors. And we know what happens when an attacker can find relatively low-hanging fruit, they're going to go after that. And as you see that kind of disparity emerge, there are going to be haves and have-nots. I think it's going to become an even more pronounced problem than it is today.
You have expressed the ambition for Sophos to erase the cybersecurity poverty line. That is such a bold statement, and so I'd really like to hear how you intend to do it.
The desire has been there for a very, very long time to achieve this, but the circumstances didn't exist. The confluence of events that has led us to this opportunity being real right now is the fact that we've seen the kind of maturity of data lakes that exist technologically within really competent EDR, XDR, MDR kind of platforms. And obviously Sophos is one of the major providers of these kinds of technologies and services today. Two is the advancement that we've seen in artificial intelligence, where we've gone from like better classifiers that are good at determining if a file is benign or malicious or a website is this category or that category, to where the models are now demonstrating really good reasoning capabilities. The generative element of this is also quite important because so much of the time that has been involved in security operations has been composition and creating timelines and writing up reports and that sort of thing. And now AI is just extraordinarily helpful as a time saver with that. And then the third element of it is actually being able to scale leadership. And when we think of cybersecurity leadership, of course, we think of the role of the CISO. We had previously shared some statistics that there are approximately 359 million organizations in operation in the world today. And there are only about 35,000 CISOs that are protecting them. Yes, that's a factor of about 10,000 to 1. Those are really not very good odds. And if you think of the poverty line as being a strategic gap within an organization, not strictly money, not strictly expertise, but some combination of the four elements that we were discussing, then this is more of a strategic gap than it is a technological gap. However, we can bring this confluence of technology and the reach that we have with our MSP partners. We can bring that combination to bear so that we can start scalably addressing that leadership gap. You could think of this notionally as being a very, very large-scale virtual CISO engagement opportunity, where those organizations who could never have previously dreamed of having a CISO can now have a CISO-like experience because of what we're able to deliver. We recently announced our Sophos Fusion platform. This is the platform that is going to enable all of that to occur. And we're going to be rapidly delivering the necessary kinds of capabilities on top of that. So you could think of it as the availability of SIM capabilities for those organizations that require long-term data retention and compliance requirements. We've got our AI defense product that is going to be launching in a couple of weeks now, and that's going to provide the kind of governance and control that organizations need to confidently deploy AI within their organizations. And then the last piece of it is going to be that virtual CISO experience. We're calling it CISO Advantage. And you could think of this as the opportunity for those organizations who don't have a CISO to get a CISO through the combination of the technology and the MSP community. And for those organizations that are a little more mature, maybe they are already operating above the poverty line, it becomes the operating platform for them to better manage and communicate risk within their organization. So it just makes the CISO's job better.
How much should we be expecting individual organizations to do to secure themselves, as opposed to what we should be doing as a community, as a society? Where do you think that line is today?
Well, I like to say that we're all more secure when we're each more secure. And I think that there is a kind of a herd immunity that we're able to achieve as more organizations are able to better secure themselves. And of course, the driver for that is the supply chain risk that we're dealing with today, or the nth party risk that we're dealing with. And we all have upstream and downstream providers. There's hundreds or maybe thousands of organizations that we rely on in order to run our business. And then we've got 625,000 customers who rely on us to stay secure and to keep them secure. So there are always these upstream and downstream dependencies that we deal with. And as we begin to deliver a rising tide, that of course lifts all boats. We want to continue to drive that as much as possible. This is where that notion of compounding benefit comes from. And for as long as the cybersecurity industry has existed, and as long as we've been talking about threat intelligence, there's always been a drive to have more threat intelligence and to be better at sharing that intelligence. And we've always been a participant in that throughout the industry, working with organizations and alliances like the Cyber Threat Alliance, and then directly with our peers in the industry. But I think that the more important part there is actually operationalizing the threat intelligence. Like, how are you putting it to work? You don't want to just have a pile of it like a dragon where it's gold and that sort of thing. It's like, it needs to be operationalized in order to be beneficial.
What are you going to do about it now that you know about this thing? What are you going to do about it?
That's
and
right.
Can you do it?
And not making it something that somebody needs to take some sort of an action to benefit from. Like, you want the default mode to be the operationalization of the intelligence. And this is where that idea of the compounding benefit that these kinds of modern platforms are capable of providing. We've seen an evolution within the industry where we started with like best of breed point products, and then you ended up with like stacks of these products that really weren't operating well with each other. And then it evolved into platforms, and platforms were designed to bring the data together to better share context across the different kinds of data sources, maybe make the actual operation and control across these discrete devices easier than if you were trying to do them all uniquely or manually. The most recent incarnation of this, and I think the most important advancement that we've seen, is taking that step where you go from a platform to a system. And the system is the thing that gives you the right kind of a default mode. It's the one that provides the operationalized compounding benefit. That's one of the driving theses of Sophos Fusion. We want it to deliver that kind of automated operation, leveraging the AI capabilities, bringing together all the data that we're getting from our first-party Sophos sources and the 500 third-party sources that we now integrate with, and just making it as simple as possible for the right things to happen without too much manual intervention.
You're right. You would see the point products, and then you'd see a platform. And then on top of that, I would see every vendor wanted to be the layer on top,
Yep.
and the single pane of glass. And, there's no such thing.
It's like Highlander.
There can be only one. Yeah, exactly.
There is a little bit of that going on. So, Wendy, this has been a great conversation. As customary, I would just like to leave our listeners with some closing thoughts. So what advice would you give to people to consider?
One of the things that tends to get bandied about in the industry is one of these scary myths that you're likely to go out of business if you have a breach. And there was some statistic that started, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, where somebody said 60% of small businesses will go out of business if they have a breach. And that's just been copied from person to person. At some point, Adrian Sanabria decided to do the math on it, and he started gathering data and researching this. First of all, he looked at the Verizon DBIR and their statistics, and he found that if you took the same statistics, 60% of SMBs and whatever, and you really did do the math, we would expect to see well over 2,000 businesses go in the United States go out of business because of a breach. We would kind of notice if it were that big. And so, that kind of disabuses us of that scary statistic. When he started gathering information on these organizations that really did go out of business, in the 10 to 15 years he's been gathering this data, he's found 35 businesses that went out as a direct result of having a breach. Only 35. And if somebody wants to add to his data, he has a site called destroyedbybreach.com. You can go there, you can see his data, you can add your own if you happen to know of an organization that he doesn't know about. But I think it's always important to bring light and truth to the things, again, that we tend to believe without thinking too hard about them.
I couldn't agree more that the industry tends to use scare tactics. Sometimes certain brands could appear to be a little ambulance chasey. And the more sunlight that we can bring to the problem, I think is very, very helpful. It helps our credibility and it helps our trustworthiness as brands and operators.
What about your final thoughts?
One, I think it would be very helpful for us to apply the security poverty line to the way that we think about the problem, move it out of the exclusive domain of technology to the combination of technology, economics, and the four pillars that you described: money, expertise, capability, and influence. I think
Messy.
Messy, that's right. Very, very helpful framing for organizations to use. And when we think about it in terms of being a strategic capabilities gap within an organization, it begins to change the way that leadership teams and boards go about trying to get better at cybersecurity. So that's one part of it. The second is, we hear this terminology a lot now lately where we talk about outcomes and focusing on outcomes rather than focusing on technologies.
Yeah.
We're here at Black Hat USA 2026 right now, and you walk the vendor hall and you see a whole bunch of acronyms. And there's EDR and DSPM, XDR, SASE, and we deal with acronym overload. These are all necessary components. These are means to an end. They're how you put solutions together. But that shouldn't be the focus. The focus really should be on the outcomes and beginning to change the way that consumers talk to their vendors and the way they talk to their service providers, and shifting it from I need technology X, Y, and Z to this is the outcome that I'm trying to achieve in my organization. How can you help me to get to that? Sometimes they don't even know what the outcome is. They just know that they want to be more resilient. And that's sufficient. You could begin the conversation with the right vendors, and the right vendors can help you to get there. And it will require this kind of leveraging of these new system capabilities that we were just spending a little bit of time talking about. And the last element, of course, is AI and the new capabilities that this enables for us, but also the risk that you were describing, how it can actually widen the gap for those organizations that are just not successfully adopting it as quickly as the adversary or as quickly as their peer might be doing in their organization. And I would encourage organizations of all sizes, small, medium, large, public, private sector, it doesn't matter where you are, how big you are, what you do, you have to start thinking about how you're going to be bringing AI to bear to help you become a stronger operating organization, help you better manage risk, and make you more resilient.
Or how your supporting provider can do that, and if you really can't stand it up yourself.
Well, that's exactly right. And you made the point, maybe I'll just come back to that for a moment, that tokenomics, and sometimes these can become runaway costs for organizations. One of the best ways to manage that is to work with an intermediary who can help you to manage that. So rather than organizations taking on direct exposures to those sorts of potential runaway costs by working with labs directly, they can work with organizations like Sophos, and we can help to manage that for them. Thank you, Wendy. That was awesome.
Thank you, Joe.
This special production was brought to you by Sophos. Learn more at sophos.com.